Hi everyone, welcome back to chapter 6 on learning and adaptations. In this couple lectures we're going to talk about operant conditioning. So previously we learned about the two other major types of learning. So our big three are event alone learning or habituation that we already talked about. Last class, we talked about event learning, also called classical conditioning. And now today, we're going to be talking about operant conditioning, which is behavior event learning. So remember that classical conditioning occurs when two stimuli become associated with each other. Whereas here, in operant conditioning, then we learn to associate our response with specific consequences. So in other words, operant conditioning is learning that is controlled by the consequences of the organism's behavior. So the organism obviously could be our dog, it could be us, it could be really any animal or organism. So again, it is sometimes called instrumental conditioning, but in this class, I'm going to focus on just calling it operant conditioning. And so what operant conditioning has is that there's a stimulus, and then the organism will respond to the stimulus, and then there'll be some sort of feedback, or what we call a reinforcer. Now this reinforcer can be positive or negative, but it's some kind of outcome that happens after the response. Now, let's just talk about some of the key differences between operant and classical conditioning. So in classical conditioning, then our target behavior is elicited automatically. In other words, remember, it's a biological response, right? Whereas in operant conditioning, then this is some sort of voluntary response. And the behavior is a function of, in classical conditioning, behavior is a function of stimuli that precedes the behavior. In other words, something beforehand dictates the behavior. Whereas in operant conditioning, then the behavior is a function of the consequences following the behavior. So some sort of feedback after the behavior determines what the future behavior will be. And then finally, the behavior depends primarily on, so in classical conditioning, remember we talked about how our behavior depends on the autonomic nervous system. So whether that's the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. However, in operant conditioning, then our behavior depends on the skeletal muscles, because remember, those are controlled voluntarily. So here's two examples of different types of conditioned learning. One of them is operant condition, and one is classical conditioning. So the first example would be Joy got sick after eating mint ice cream, and now she hates mint ice cream. So is that classical conditioning or operant conditioning? Think about that, and let's read number 2. So number 2 is, each time Andy does his homework, he gets a cookie. Now he does his homework without being told to. So is that one operant or classical? So again, for each of this, think about, is their behavior being controlled by something that happened before the response or after the response? So let's look at number 1 again. So Joy got sick after eating mint ice cream. Okay, so she ate mint ice cream and then got sick. And now she doesn't like mint ice cream. Okay. So, again, this one is an example of classical conditioning. Why? because the stimuli would be eating mint ice cream, and the response happened after the stimuli. So she got sick after eating it, right? So eating it mint ice cream, and then she got sick. Whereas number 2, this is operant conditioning, because when he does his homework, then he gets a cookie. So the cookie is some sort of response, some sort of reward. So now when he does his homework, which is the response, his response is doing his homework, he doesn't have to be told to. So normally, what we can extract from this is that he's told to do his homework, he does his homework, gets a cookie. But now, because of something that happened after his response, right? So the stimuli was being told to do his homework, his response was to do his homework, and then his reinforcer or outcome was to get a cookie. So now he will do his homework without being told to. So the cookie comes after the response. And so that's why it's operant conditioning. Now we'll start going into operant conditioning a bit more, so you'll really be able to understand the difference. So the first thing we need to talk about when talking about operant conditioning is the law of effect. So the law of effect was discovered by a guy named Edward Thorndike. When we say discovered by, it's really, he kind of was the first one to put it into words. And he said, if a response in the presence of a stimuli is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the bond between the stimulus and the response will be strengthened. So pretty much what he's saying is, if something good or something satisfying happens after a response, we're going to have a stronger relationship between the stimulus and the response. Whereas if there's something unsatisfying or negative that happens after a response, then the relationship between the stimulus and the response will be less. A bit confusing, but let's talk about it some more. So, the basis of learning is saying that there's a basis for an SR theories of learning. So, stimulus response. So, there's always some sort of relationship between the stimulus and the response, right? So, according to SR theorists, so people that follow the law of effect, almost everything we do voluntarily is a buildup of SR bonds. So everything we do is as a result of some sort of relationship between a stimulus and a response. So we can see this in what we call puzzle boxes. So puzzle boxes is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a box. And there's multiple different escape routes from the box, either to enter the box or to leave the box. And each escape route has a different type of, we'll say, mechanism. So like here, maybe you have to slide the door up, and then if there's another one here, then you have to push a button, and then it'll open. And maybe there's another one, and the key to getting that one to work is you have to slide it down instead of this one sliding up, something like that. So there's puzzles. And what we can see is when we place a hungry cat in a puzzle box, and we put some sort of motivation on the outside, so that could be like milk or food, then the hungry cat will escape quicker to get access to that food than if we were to put a unhungry cat. So if we have a cat, we feed him a lot, we put him in the box, and then we put food outside, well, if he's not hungry, he's not going to try to, figure out the puzzles to get to the food, because he just doesn't care. However, a hungry cat will. So, What they found is that even with a hungry cat, the very first time you put a hungry cat in a box, it kind of takes them a long time to figure out the solution to the puzzle. Whereas every time after that, then the cat learns how to solve the puzzle and will get out of the box quicker to get to the food. So what it's showing is that learning doesn't depend on reasoning, that learning is incremental, right? So this has contributed to the law of effect. And now why are we talking about this with operant conditioning? Well, we're talking about it because this is a form of operant conditioning. Because if we look back here, then we have a cat in a box. And what we want is for the cat to solve the puzzles. Now, the cat's not going to just solve the puzzles willy-nilly, but by having food outside, then we're giving them motivation. So if you solve the puzzles, you get food. So now they're going to solve the puzzle faster, which is what we want. That's the response, because of the food reward. Okay, so this is an example of operant conditioning. So before, then we were just talking about the law of effect and this relationship between the stimulus and response. And again, that was by an Edward Thorndike. But now we have this guy that came in, and this guy is called B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner is the first one to really identify the key processes that take place in operant conditioning. And he actually created this thing. He called it a Skinner box after himself, just like old white guys love to do. But pretty much it's what we call today an operant chamber. So it's pretty much a chamber that we use for operant conditioning. So here's an example of an operant chamber or a Skinner box. So it's a box that you put the animal in, and then they have to do a task. So this one is there's a bar here that the rat has to push. And if he pushes it, if he does the response, then he gets rewarded with food. So Skinner first developed this as a way to electronically record an animal's activity. And it automatically provided the reinforcement in response to specific actions. So again, remember how we need a stimulus first before the response? So the stimulus here would be either a red or a green light. So for instance, what we'll learn is that, say, if the red light's on, then the rat doesn't need to do anything. But if the green light's on, then the rat should push the bar and they'll be rewarded with food. Okay, so the stimulus is green, the response is push the bar, and the reward is food. Now, if the rat pushes the bar when the red light's on, then nothing's going to happen. They won't get any food. And so over time, then the rat will learn to only press the bar when it sees green. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's stop here, and then in the next lecture, we'll get into exactly how the different reinforcements